David Miller's mop hit something soft in the darkness of the 47th floor. He'd been cleaning Hayes Tower for 3 years, always alone after midnight, always invisible to the people who owned this gleaming world above the clouds. But tonight, the CEO of Hayes Industries lay unconscious on her office floor, her perfectly pressed suit wrinkled, her iron control shattered. As David knelt beside Victoria Hayes and felt for her pulse, he had no idea he was about to save the woman who had destroyed his life 10 years ago. When she opened her eyes in that hospital room hours later, her first words weren't, "Thank you." They were something that would haunt him for months to come. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as David Miller pushed his cleaning cart down the marble hallway of Hayes Tower. It was midnight, and the 47th floor stretched before him like a sleeping giant, all chrome and glass and the lingering scent of expensive coffee and ambition. David had cleaned these floors for 3 years now, ever since the construction company he'd worked for went under and left him scrambling to keep food on the table for Emma. His daughter would be asleep now in their small apartment across town, curled up with the worn, stuffed rabbit that had been her mother's last gift. Sarah had bought it just days before the accident that changed everything. David tried not to think about Sarah when he worked these late hours, tried to focus on the rhythm of his tasks instead. Vacuum the carpets, empty the trash bins, polish the conference tables where million-dollar deals were made by people who never saw his face. The executive offices occupied the entire west wing, their floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city that David had grown to appreciate during his solitary hours. Sometimes he'd pause in his work and look out at the scattered lights below, imagining the lives behind each glowing window. Families gathered around dinner tables, children being tucked into bed. Normal people living normal lives in a way that felt increasingly foreign to him. Tonight felt different, though. There was tension in the air, a heaviness that made David's movements more deliberate. He'd noticed it when he'd arrived at work that evening. The security guard, Tommy, had been unusually quiet during their brief exchange at the front desk. Several of the offices still had lights burning, which was rare for this hour. Even the building itself seemed to hum with an underlying anxiety. Victoria Hayes' corner office was David's last stop of the night. He'd never met the woman who ran Hayes Industries, but he'd seen her photograph in the business magazines that littered the waiting areas. She was younger than he'd expected when he'd first seen her picture, maybe early 50s, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to look right through whatever camera was pointed at her. The magazines called her a visionary, a pioneer who had built her technology company from nothing into a billion-dollar empire. To David, she was just another name on another door in another building he'd never belonged to. He knocked softly on her office door out of habit, though he knew she wouldn't be there. The executives were long gone by the time David began his rounds, safely tucked away in their suburban mansions or penthouse apartments. But as he turned his key in the lock and pushed open the heavy wooden door, something made him pause. The office was dark except for the glow from the city lights streaming through the massive windows. David reached for the light switch, then stopped. Something was wrong. The air felt different, charged with an electricity that raised the hair on his arms. And there was a sound, barely audible but distinctly human. A soft, irregular breathing that didn't belong in an empty office. David's hand found the light switch, and the room flooded with harsh fluorescent brightness. That's when he saw her. Victoria Hayes lay crumpled beside her desk, one arm twisted awkwardly beneath her body, her face pale as the marble floors David polished every night. Her legendary composure was gone, replaced by the vulnerable stillness of someone whose body had betrayed them in the most fundamental way. For a moment, David stood frozen in the doorway, his cleaning supplies forgotten. This was Victoria Hayes, the woman whose face graced the covers of Fortune and Forbes, whose decisions affected thousands of employees and millions of shareholders. And she was lying unconscious on her office floor, while David Miller, invisible janitor and single father, was the only person in the world who knew. His training from his construction days kicked in before his mind could fully process what he was seeing. David dropped his supplies and rushed to Victoria's side, kneeling on the expensive carpet as he checked for signs of life. Her pulse was weak but steady, her breathing shallow but regular. A stroke, most likely, or perhaps a heart attack. The exact diagnosis didn't matter as much as getting her help as quickly as possible. David pulled his phone from his pocket with shaking hands and dialed 911. As he waited for the operator to answer, he found himself studying Victoria's face. Without the armor of her business suits and boardroom confidence, she looked smaller somehow, more human. There were lines around her eyes that the magazine photographs didn't show, and her hands, David noticed, bore the calluses of someone who had once worked with them. 911, what's your emergency? I need an ambulance at Hayes Tower, 47th floor. A woman has collapsed, possibly a stroke or heart attack. She's breathing but unconscious. David stayed on the line as instructed, monitoring Victoria's vital signs and providing updates to the dispatcher. He loosened her collar and positioned her on her side, following the basic first aid protocols he'd learned years ago. It felt surreal to be touching this powerful woman, to be responsible for her life in a way that no boardroom decision could ever prepare someone for. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their heavy boots echoing through the empty hallways as they rushed toward Victoria's office. David stepped back as they took over, watching as they efficiently assessed her condition and prepared her for transport. One of them, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, asked David what he'd witnessed. I just found her like this, he said. I'm the night janitor. I was making my rounds when I discovered her on the floor. You did good, the paramedic said. Quick thinking probably saved her life. As they loaded Victoria onto a stretcher, her eyes fluttered open for just a moment. Her gaze found David's face, and for a heartbeat, there was recognition there, not of who he was, necessarily, but of what he had done. Then her eyes closed again, and the paramedics wheeled her away, leaving David alone in the sudden silence of the executive office. He should have gone back to his cleaning, should have finished his shift, and gone home to Emma as he did every night. But something kept him standing there in Victoria Hayes' office, surrounded by the trappings of a success he could never imagine achieving. Awards lined the shelves, photographs showed her shaking hands with presidents and celebrities, and her desk was covered with documents that probably represented more money than David would see in a lifetime. On impulse, David followed the ambulance to the hospital. He told himself it was just to make sure she was okay, that any decent person would want to know the outcome of such a dramatic night. But as he sat in the emergency room waiting area, still wearing his custodial uniform and smelling faintly of industrial cleaning supplies, he began to question his own motives. The hospital was quiet at this hour, populated only by medical staff and the worried families of people who couldn't wait for daylight to fall apart. David found himself thinking about Sarah, about the last time he'd sat in a hospital waiting room praying for news that never came. The memory made his chest tight, but he pushed it away. This was different. Victoria Hayes was going to be fine. A doctor emerged from behind the double doors marked "Authorized personnel only" and approached the reception desk. David couldn't hear the conversation, but he watched as the doctor spoke in low, serious tones to the nurse on duty. After a few moments, the doctor looked around the waiting room, his eyes settling on David. "Are you the gentleman who found Miss Hayes?" David nodded and stood up, suddenly self-conscious about his appearance in this sterile, professional environment. "She's stable," the doctor said. "You got to her just in time. A few more hours and we might be having a very different conversation." Will she be okay? She had what we call a transient ischemic attack, a mini-stroke. With proper treatment and some lifestyle changes, most people recover completely. She's asking to see you, actually. David felt his stomach lurch. Victoria Hayes wanted to see him? The idea seemed impossible, like being summoned to meet with the president or the Pope. But he followed the doctor through the maze of hospital corridors, past rooms filled with people fighting their own battles against mortality and time. Victoria's room was private and comfortable, more like a hotel suite than a hospital room. She was awake, propped up against several pillows, and despite the hospital gown and the IV line in her arm, she managed to maintain an air of authority that even a medical emergency couldn't completely strip away. "Mr. she began, her voice hoarse but determined. "Miller? David Miller?" "Mr. Miller." She studied his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "I understand I owe you my life." David shifted his weight from one foot to the other, unsure how to respond to such a formal acknowledgement of what had felt like simple human decency. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No," Victoria said, her voice gaining strength. "Most people would have called security and let someone else handle it. You stayed with me. You probably saved my life." She paused, and David could see her struggling with something, some internal debate that played out across her features. When she spoke again, her words were not what David expected. "I need you to promise me something, Mr. Miller." "What's that?" Victoria's eyes met his with an intensity that seemed to pierce right through him. "Don't tell anyone about this. Not the paramedics' report, not what you saw, not that I was there at all tonight. As far as anyone knows, you found an empty office and went about your business." David stared at her, confused by the request. "I don't understand. Why would you want to keep this secret?" "Because," Victoria said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime making difficult decisions, "in my world, weakness is a luxury I can't afford. If my shareholders, my board of directors, my competitors find out that their CEO collapsed alone in her office, it will destroy everything I've built. I need time to recover, to figure out how to handle this." The request sat strangely with David. He had never thought about the peculiar prison that success could create, the way that being responsible for so many people could make a person responsible to no one, especially not themselves. But looking at Victoria Hayes, pale and vulnerable in her hospital bed, he began to understand the weight she carried. "I don't talk to shareholders or board members," David said. "I'm just the guy who cleans the floors." "Promise me," Victoria insisted. "Your word." David considered the request. It seemed harmless enough, and after what they had both been through that night, it felt like the least he could do. "I promise. I won't tell anyone." Something in Victoria's expression softened, though whether it was relief or gratitude, David couldn't tell. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. I won't forget this." As David made his way back through the hospital corridors and out into the pre-dawn darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet understand. The city was beginning to wake up around him, early commuters starting their journeys to jobs where they would spend their days in buildings like Hayes Tower, creating wealth for people like Victoria Hayes. But for the first time in 3 years, David felt like more than just another invisible figure moving through other people's lives. He had been seen, acknowledged, trusted with something important. As he drove home to Emma, who would be waking up soon and needing breakfast and help getting ready for school, David found himself wondering what it would be like to matter to someone beyond the small circle of his own family. He had no way of knowing that Victoria Hayes was lying awake in her hospital room, staring at the ceiling, and wrestling with emotions she hadn't allowed herself to feel in over a decade. She had built her entire adult life around control, around being the person who made the decisions that affected everyone else. But tonight, her life had been in the hands of David Miller, a man she had never met, whose kindness was as foreign to her world as her wealth was to his. Victoria closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but instead she found herself thinking about the way David had looked at her, not with the calculated interest of someone seeking advantage, not with the fear that so many people brought to their interactions with her, but with simple human concern. When was the last time someone had looked at her that way? She couldn't remember. The morning brought new challenges for both of them. David returned home to find Sophie already awake, sitting at their small kitchen table with her homework spread out around her. His daughter looked up as he entered, her dark eyes so much like her mother's that it still took David's breath away sometimes. "You're late, Daddy," Emma said, not accusingly, but with the matter-of-fact observation that 8-year-olds were famous for. "I know, sweetheart. Something came up at work." David moved around their tiny kitchen, starting coffee and pulling ingredients from the refrigerator for Emma's lunch. The domestic routine felt both comforting and strange after the intensity of the night he'd just experienced. "Was it important?" Sophie asked, returning her attention to her math worksheet. David paused, considering the question. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that you had held a woman's life in your hands, that you had been trusted with secrets that could affect thousands of jobs and millions of dollars? How do you describe the strange intimacy of seeing one of the most powerful people in the city at their most vulnerable? "Yeah," he said finally. "I think it was." Meanwhile, across the city, Victoria Hayes was checking herself out of the hospital against her doctor's advice. She had calls to make, meetings to reschedule, a careful story to construct about why she wouldn't be in the office for the next few days. Her assistant, Margaret, had been with her for 15 years and could handle the logistics of maintaining the illusion that everything was normal. But as Victoria sat in the back of the car her driver had sent to collect her, she found her thoughts drifting back to David Miller. She had his employment file pulled up on her phone, the basic information that human resources kept on all building staff. 45 years old, widowed, 1 dependent child. Previous employment with Morrison Construction until the company's bankruptcy 3 years earlier. No disciplinary actions, no complaints, no particular distinctions. The file told her nothing about the man who had knelt beside her on her office floor, who had stayed calm in a crisis, who had looked at her with such uncomplicated concern. Victoria was accustomed to having detailed information about everyone in her orbit, but David Miller remained an enigma, someone who had touched her life in the most fundamental way while remaining essentially invisible to her world. Over the following weeks, Victoria found herself paying attention to details she had never noticed before. She began staying later at the office, not to work, but to catch glimpses of David during his nighttime rounds. She watched through security cameras as he methodically cleaned each floor, noting the care he took with tasks that most people would consider menial. She saw him stop to water a dying plant in the lobby, saw him carefully repair a broken chair instead of simply reporting it for replacement. She watched him work with a quiet competence that spoke to a pride in his labor that had nothing to do with recognition or advancement. In a world where everyone seemed to want something from Victoria Hayes, David Miller appeared to want nothing at all. The observation unsettled her in ways she couldn't quite articulate. Victoria had built her success on understanding people's motivations, on knowing what drove them and how to use those drives to her advantage. But David's contentment with invisibility, his satisfaction with honest work, honestly done, challenged everything she thought she knew about human nature. She began to research him more carefully, using resources that went far beyond the basic employment file. What she discovered painted a picture of quiet tragedy and remarkable resilience. David had been married to Sarah Coleman Miller, an elementary school teacher who had died in a car accident 3 years earlier. The accident report was brief but devastating. A multi-car collision on I-95 during a rainstorm, 3 fatalities including a young mother on her way home from a parent-teacher conference. Victoria read the report 3 times before the date registered. March 15th, 3 years ago. She remembered that date for her own reasons, remembered the way the rain had made driving treacherous, remembered the phone call from her lawyer about a settlement that needed to be handled quietly and quickly. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Sarah Coleman Miller had been one of the 3 people who died in the accident that Victoria's driver had caused. Victoria had never seen the police report, had never known the names of the other victims. Her lawyer had handled everything, making sure that the settlements were generous and anonymous, that Victoria's involvement never became public knowledge. She had been in the back seat of her company car that night, distracted by a phone call with a client in Tokyo, when her driver had lost control on the wet pavement. Victoria had walked away with minor injuries, but 3 families had been destroyed. She had paid for the funerals, established anonymous trust funds for the surviving family members, done everything that money could do to address the irreparable harm that had been done. But she had never faced the people whose lives she had shattered. Now one of them cleaned her floors every night, had saved her life, had looked at her with kindness and concern while having no idea who she really was. The irony was so sharp, it took Victoria's breath away. For the first time in her adult life, Victoria Hayes didn't know what to do. The weight of the revelation consumed her thoughts for days. She found herself unable to concentrate during board meetings, unable to sleep through the night, unable to look at herself in the mirror without seeing the ghost of Sarah Coleman Miller staring back at her. Victoria had spent years perfecting the art of compartmentalization, of separating her business decisions from their human consequences. But this was different. This was personal in a way that made her previous detachment impossible. She began to watch David's daughter as well. Sophie Miller attended Riverside Elementary, just 4 miles from Hayes Tower. Victoria found herself driving past the school during pickup time, watching as 8-year-old Emma waited by the fence with the other children whose parents worked late shifts. A babysitter collected Emma most days, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson who lived in their apartment building and watched several children for working parents. Emma was small for her age, with dark hair that she wore in 2 neat braids and an air of premature responsibility that reminded Victoria painfully of her own childhood. The girl carried herself with the careful composure of a child who had learned too young that life was fragile, that the adults she depended on could disappear without warning. Victoria had been that child once, before success had built walls around her heart, before she had learned that caring too much was a vulnerability that could be exploited, that love was a luxury that successful people couldn't afford. Looking at Sophie Miller, Victoria saw all the innocence she had lost, all the trust that had been stripped away by years of corporate warfare and personal tragedy. The irony was exquisite in its cruelty. Victoria had been trying to atone for the accident in the only way she knew how, through anonymous financial support and charitable donations. She had established a scholarship fund for children who had lost parents, had quietly funded grief counseling programs, had done everything that money could do to balance the scales of justice. But none of it had brought her peace, and none of it had brought Sarah Coleman Miller back to life. Now she was confronted daily with the living consequences of that terrible night. David Miller cleaned her floors with the same gentle competence he probably brought to raising his daughter alone. Sophie Miller grew up without a mother because Victoria Hayes had been too important, too busy, too focused on her next deal to pay attention to the weather conditions or her driver's fatigue level. The guilt was eating her alive. Victoria's second collapse came 3 weeks after the first, this time more severe and impossible to hide. She was in the middle of a presentation to potential investors when the world suddenly tilted sideways, and she found herself on the conference room floor with a dozen concerned faces staring down at her. This time, David wasn't there to help her. It was Margaret, her assistant, who called the ambulance and rode with her to the hospital. It was the company's chief financial officer who fielded the panicked phone calls from board members and shareholders. And it was David Miller who heard about it through the building's security network and found himself, despite every rational thought telling him otherwise, heading to the hospital again. He arrived to find chaos in the cardiac wing. Victoria's condition was more serious this time, and the hospital staff moved with the urgent efficiency reserved for cases where minutes could mean the difference between life and death. David stood in the waiting room, still wearing his custodial uniform, feeling completely out of place among the expensive suits and worried expressions of Victoria's business associates. Margaret noticed him first. Victoria's assistant was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair and the kind of competent demeanor that came from decades of managing other people's crises. She approached David with a curious expression, clearly trying to place him in the hierarchy of people who might have legitimate reason to be concerned about Victoria Hayes' welfare. "I'm sorry, are you family?" Margaret asked. "No, David struggled to explain his presence without revealing the secret Victoria had asked him to keep. "I work in the building. I heard what happened." "Oh." Margaret's expression softened slightly. "That's very kind of you to come. I'm Margaret Walsh, Ms. Hayes' assistant." Before David could respond, a small voice behind him asked, "Daddy, why are we at the hospital again?" David turned to see Sophie standing in the doorway, her backpack still slung over her shoulder, her dark eyes wide with the kind of worry that no 8-year-old should have to carry. Mrs. Patterson stood behind her, looking apologetic and concerned. "I'm sorry, David," the older woman said. "Sophie saw the news report about the CEO at your building, and she was so worried that something had happened to you. I couldn't calm her down, so I thought maybe if she saw you were okay—" Sophie rushed to her father's side, wrapping her arms around his waist with the fierce intensity of a child who had already lost one parent and lived in constant fear of losing the other. David knelt down to her level, smoothing her hair and speaking in the gentle tone he reserved for her most vulnerable moments. "I'm fine, sweetheart. I'm perfectly fine. I just came to check on someone who got hurt." "But why?" Sophie asked, her voice small and confused. "You don't know any rich people." The innocence of the question cut through David like a knife. His daughter was right, of course. In Sophie's world, there was a clear distinction between people like them and people like Victoria Hayes. Rich people lived in different neighborhoods, went to different schools, inhabited an entirely different universe from the one she and her father occupied. But Sophie was wrong about one thing. David did know Victoria Hayes, in a way that went deeper than business relationships or social connections. He had held her life in his hands, had seen her at her most vulnerable, had been trusted with secrets that could destroy her carefully constructed world. And now, looking down at his daughter's worried face, he realized that Victoria Hayes knew him too, in ways that neither of them had fully understood until this moment. Margaret had been watching this exchange with growing interest, and when Emma mentioned her father's work at the building, something clicked in her expression. "You're David Miller," she said, and it wasn't a question. David looked up at her, surprised by the recognition in her voice. "Ms. Hayes told me about you," Margaret continued. "She said you helped her a few weeks ago when she wasn't feeling well. She's been asking about you, actually, about your family." The words sent a chill down David's spine. Victoria Hayes had been asking about his family? About Emma? The idea that his daughter had somehow appeared on the radar of one of the most powerful women in the city was both flattering and terrifying. "She wanted to do something nice for you," Margaret said. "To thank you for your help. She's been looking into scholarship programs, educational opportunities for your daughter." David felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. Educational opportunities, scholarship programs. The anonymous benefactor who had been helping his family for the past 3 years, the mysterious donor whose generosity had made it possible for David to keep Sophie in a good school, to afford the medical care she needed, to maintain some semblance of stability after Sarah's death. It couldn't be a coincidence. "Mrs. Walsh," David said carefully, "how long has Ms. Hayes been interested in helping families like mine?" Margaret seemed surprised by the question. "Oh, for years now. She's very passionate about supporting single parents, children who've lost mothers. It started after her own son died, I think. She never talks about it, but she's donated millions to programs that help families dealing with loss." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with sickening clarity. Victoria Hayes had been his anonymous benefactor, not out of generosity, but out of guilt. She had been paying for Sophie's school, her medical care, their stability, not because she wanted to help them, but because she was the reason they needed help in the first place. David felt Sophie's small hand slip into his, anchoring him to the present moment, even as his world tilted on its axis. His daughter was looking up at him with concern, sensing the change in his emotional state the way children do, with an intuition that adults often lose. "Daddy, are you okay?" Sophie asked. "I'm fine, baby," David said, though he was anything but fine. "Why don't you and Mrs. Patterson go get some hot chocolate from the cafeteria? I need to talk to Mrs. Walsh for a few minutes." Sophie hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave her father in this strange place that reminded her too much of the night they'd lost her mother. But Mrs. Patterson took her hand gently, promising her that they'd be right back, and the two of them headed down the corridor toward the elevators. Margaret watched them go, then turned back to David with a puzzled expression. "Is everything all right, Mr. Miller? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Mrs. Walsh," David said, his voice carefully controlled. "I need to ask you about the car accident 3 years ago, the one on I-95. Margaret's face went pale. In all her years working for Victoria Hayes, very few people had ever connected her boss to that terrible night. The settlement had been handled so quietly, so completely, that even most of Victoria's inner circle knew nothing about it. "I don't know what you're talking about," Margaret said, but her voice lacked conviction. "March 15th, 3 years ago," David continued. "3 people died. One of them was my wife." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation. Margaret stared at David, as if she were seeing him for the first time, as if all the pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed were suddenly arranging themselves in her mind. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You're Sarah's husband." The confirmation hit David like a physical blow. Sarah's husband, not David Miller, custodian and single father, but Sarah's husband, one half of a tragedy that Victoria Hayes had been carrying like a stone in her chest for 3 years. "She doesn't know, does she?" Margaret asked. "She has no idea who you are." "She knows now," David said grimly. "Or she will soon." At that moment, a doctor emerged from the cardiac unit, looking for Victoria's family. Margaret introduced herself and David as concerned friends, and the doctor provided a brief update on Victoria's condition. She was stable, but would need to stay in the hospital for several days while they ran additional tests and adjusted her medication. "She's asking to see someone named David," the doctor said. "She's been quite insistent about it, actually." Margaret looked at David with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and apprehension. "I think," she said quietly, "that conversation has been a long time coming." David found Victoria in a room that was more luxurious than the one she'd occupied after her first collapse. Private, quiet, with a view of the city that stretched out below like a glittering carpet of possibilities and dreams. She was awake when he entered, propped up against pillows that were more comfortable than any bed David had ever owned. She looked older than she had 3 weeks ago, as if the weight of secrets had been aging her at an accelerated pace. When she saw David in the doorway, something in her expression cracked, and for a moment he saw not the CEO of Hayes Industries, but simply a woman who had been carrying an unbearable burden for far too long. "You know," she said, and it wasn't a question. "I know," David confirmed. They stared at each other across the sterile hospital room, 2 people whose lives had been intertwined by tragedy and coincidence, by guilt and forgiveness, by the strange alchemy that sometimes transforms enemies into something more complex and harder to define. "I've been trying to find a way to tell you," Victoria said. "For weeks, ever since I realized who you were. I kept thinking there must be some way to explain, some way to make you understand that it wasn't intentional, that if I could take it back..." You can't take it back, David said, his voice flat. Sarah is still dead. Sophie still doesn't have a mother. I still go to bed every night in an empty house, wondering how I'm going to raise a daughter by myself. Victoria flinched as if he'd struck her. I know I can't fix what happened, but I've been trying to help in whatever way I could. The scholarship money, David said. The medical bills that mysteriously got paid. The anonymous donations that kept us afloat when I thought we were going to lose everything. I wanted to do more, Victoria said. I wanted to do everything, but I was afraid that if you knew it was me, if you knew I was connected to the accident, you'd refuse the help. And Sophie needed that help. David felt a surge of anger so pure and hot that it took his breath away. You don't get to make decisions about what Sophie needs. You don't get to play puppet master with our lives just because you feel guilty about what happened. You're right, Victoria said immediately. You're absolutely right. I had no right to interfere, no right to try to manage your lives from the shadows. I needed to do something. The guilt was killing me. The guilt should kill you, David said harshly. My wife is dead because your driver was going too fast in the rain. My daughter grew up without a mother because you were too important to drive yourself, too busy to pay attention to the weather. You get to feel guilty about that for the rest of your life. Victoria nodded, tears streaming down her face. I do, every single day. I see Sarah's face every time I close my eyes. I think about Sophie growing up without her mother, about you having to explain to an 8-year-old why Mommy isn't coming home. I think about all the things Sarah will miss, all the moments you'll have to handle alone. Then why? David asked, his voice breaking. Why did you ask me to keep your collapse a secret? Why did you trust me with something that important when you knew what you'd done to my family? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the city lights. When she spoke again, her voice was so soft David had to strain to hear her. Because in that moment, when I opened my eyes and saw your face, you weren't looking at me like I was Victoria Hayes, CEO and destroyer of lives. You were looking at me like I was just another human being who needed help. And I realized that it had been years since anyone had looked at me that way. The honesty in her voice disarmed David's anger, at least temporarily. He sank into the visitor's chair beside her bed, suddenly exhausted by the emotional weight of the conversation. I don't know how to forgive you, he said. I don't even know if I want to forgive you. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Victoria replied. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I am asking you to let me help Sophie, legitimately this time. Not from the shadows, not through anonymous donations, but openly. Let me set up a college fund for her. Let me make sure she has every opportunity that Sarah would have wanted her to have. David considered the offer. It would solve so many of his financial worries, would open doors for Sophie that he could never open on his own. But accepting help from Victoria Hayes felt like a betrayal of Sarah's memory, like putting a price on his wife's life. I need time, he said finally. I need time to think about all of this, to figure out what's best for Emma. Of course, Victoria said. Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready to talk. David stood to leave, then paused at the door. The night you collapsed the first time, when you asked me to keep it secret, did you know then who I was? Victoria shook her head. I didn't know until later when I started researching you. That night I just knew that you were someone who had helped me without expecting anything in return. In my world, that's so rare it felt like a miracle. David left the hospital with his head spinning, Sophie's small hand in his as they walked through the parking garage toward their car. His daughter had been unusually quiet during the drive home, sensing the undercurrents of adult drama that she couldn't quite understand. Daddy, Sophie said as they pulled into their apartment complex. Is the lady in the hospital going to be okay? I think so, sweetheart. I think she's going to be fine. Are you friends with her? David considered the question. Were he and Victoria Hayes friends? Enemies? Something more complicated than either term could capture. It's complicated, baby, he said. Sometimes grown-up relationships are hard to explain. Sophie nodded solemnly, as if this explanation made perfect sense to her 8-year-old understanding of the world. Will you still help her if she needs help? The question stopped David cold. Out of the mouths of babes, as Sarah used to say. Sophie had distilled the entire complex situation down to its essential question. Would David choose compassion over anger? Would he choose to help someone who needed help, regardless of their shared history? I don't know yet, David said honestly. But that's a good question to ask. Over the following months, David and Victoria began the slow, careful process of building something that wasn't quite friendship, but was more than mere acquaintance. Victoria stepped down as CEO of Hayes Industries, citing health concerns, and devoted herself to the charitable foundation she established in Sarah's name. The Sarah Coleman Miller Foundation focused on supporting single-parent families, providing educational opportunities for children who had lost parents, and funding grief counseling programs. David found himself drawn into the foundation's work, first as a consultant helping to identify families in need, then as the foundation's director of family services. It felt strange to be working alongside the woman who had destroyed his family, but it also felt right in a way that surprised him. Victoria's guilt and his grief had created a shared understanding of loss that transcended their different backgrounds and circumstances. Sophie thrived in this new environment. The foundation's offices became a second home to her after school, and Victoria, who had lost her own son years earlier, found herself forming a tentative relationship with the daughter of the woman she had killed. It was complicated and painful and beautiful all at once. Two people learning to care for each other despite the tragedy that connected them. The foundation's work brought David into contact with dozens of families dealing with loss, and he discovered that he had a gift for helping people navigate the practical and emotional challenges of rebuilding their lives after tragedy. His own experience with sudden, devastating loss gave him a credibility with grieving families that no amount of professional training could provide. Victoria watched him work with something approaching awe. David had transformed his own pain into a source of strength for others, had chosen to use his experience with tragedy as a tool for helping, rather than as a weapon for revenge. She had spent years trying to atone for the accident through financial donations and anonymous charity, but David was showing her a different path, one that required personal investment rather than just money. The relationship between them remained complex and sometimes difficult. There were days when David looked at Victoria and saw only the person responsible for Sarah's death, when his grief was too fresh and his anger too sharp for civility. There were days when Victoria's guilt overwhelmed her ability to function, when the weight of what she had done made it impossible for her to get out of bed. But there were also days when they worked together seamlessly, when their shared commitment to helping other families overshadowed their personal history. There were moments when David saw Victoria not as Sarah's killer, but as another person trying to make sense of senseless tragedy. Another human being doing her best to create something meaningful from something terrible. Sophie was the bridge between them, the innocent connection that made their complicated relationship possible. The little girl had never known the details of her mother's death, knew only that there had been an accident, and that sometimes accidents happened to good people. She accepted Victoria's presence in their lives with the adaptability of childhood, treating her as another adult who cared about her welfare rather than as a source of complex emotional drama. One evening, 6 months after Victoria's second collapse, David found himself working late at the foundation offices. Sophie was at a sleepover with friends, and the building was quiet except for the hum of computers and the distant sound of traffic. Victoria emerged from her office carrying 2 cups of coffee, a gesture that had become routine during their long working sessions. "The Patterson family called today," she said, settling into the chair across from David's desk. "They wanted to thank us for the scholarship money. Their daughter got into Columbia." David smiled, remembering the Pattersons. The father had been killed in a construction accident, leaving behind a wife and 3 children. The family had been struggling to keep their oldest daughter in school when the foundation intervened. "That's wonderful," David said. Sarah would have been proud. It was the first time either of them had mentioned Sarah's name in a positive context, the first time David had suggested that his wife would approve of their work together. Victoria looked surprised by the comment, then grateful. "Do you think so?" she asked. "Do you really think she would have understood what we're doing here?" David considered the question carefully. Sarah had been a teacher, someone who had dedicated her life to helping children reach their potential. She had believed in second chances, in the power of education to transform lives, in the importance of helping people when they needed it most. "I think," David said slowly, "that Sarah would have wanted us to find a way to turn something terrible into something good. I think she would have wanted Sophie to grow up knowing that tragedy doesn't have to be the end of the story." Victoria nodded, tears in her eyes. "I hope you're right. I know I'm right," David said with more certainty than he felt. "Sarah always said that the measure of a person wasn't what happened to them, but what they chose to do about what happened to them. We're choosing to help people. We're choosing to make something better out of something that was broken." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. 2 people who had been brought together by tragedy and had somehow managed to create something meaningful from their shared pain. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, and it wasn't friendship in any conventional sense. But it was something, a relationship built on mutual respect and a shared commitment to honoring the memory of a woman who had died too young. As David packed up his work for the evening, Victoria remained at her desk, staring out at the city lights that stretched to the horizon. The view from the foundation offices wasn't as grand as the one from Hayes Tower, but it felt more honest somehow, more connected to the real lives of real people dealing with real problems. "David?" Victoria said as he prepared to leave. "Yeah? Thank you. For giving me a chance to be better than I was." David paused in the doorway, considering her words. "Thank you for saving my life that night," he said finally. "I didn't know I needed saving, but I did." It was true, David realized as he drove home through the quiet streets. After Sarah's death, he had been going through the motions of living without really being alive. The foundation work had given him purpose again, had shown him that his experience with loss could be transformed into something that helped others heal. Victoria Hayes had taken his wife away from him, but she had also given him back his sense of meaning. It was a trade-off that no one should have to make, but it was the reality they both had to live with. As he pulled into his apartment complex, David saw Sophie's drawing on the refrigerator, a colorful picture of people holding hands under a bright sun. At the bottom, in her careful 8-year-old handwriting, she had written, "People who help each other." Sophie was right, as children often were about the things that mattered most. They were people who helped each other, despite everything that had happened, despite all the reasons they had to hate each other. They were proof that forgiveness was possible, that healing could happen, that love could grow even in the darkest soil. David Miller had saved Victoria Hayes' life that night in her office. But over the months that followed, they had saved each other in ways that were deeper and more lasting. They had learned that redemption was possible, that people could change, that even the most terrible tragedies could be transformed into something that honored the memory of those who were lost. It wasn't the ending that either of them had expected, but it was the ending they had chosen. And sometimes, David thought as he fell asleep in his empty house, choosing to be better than your circumstances was the most heroic thing anyone could do.